kitchen window was fogging up from the heat of the stove, but Margaret could still see the dark clouds rolling in from the mountains. She'd lived in Montana long enough to know what those clouds meant. The weatherman on the radio had been talking about it all morning, warning folks to stock up and stay inside. A real nasty storm was coming, the kind that could bury the whole valley in snow before morning. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, checked the pot of soup simmering on the stove. At 78 years old, she'd seen her fair share of blizzards. This old farmhouse had kept her safe through worse. Still, there was something about storms that made her miss Harold even more. He'd been gone 2 years now, and the house felt bigger and quieter every winter. She walked to the living room and added another log to the fireplace. The wood crackled and popped, sending up a shower of orange sparks. Through the front window, she could see the first snowflakes starting to fall. They were small now, but she knew that wouldn't last. Within an hour, those delicate flakes would turn into a wall of white that would make it impossible to see 10 feet in front of you. Margaret settled into Harold's old recliner with a cup of tea. She'd call it an early night, maybe read a few chapters of her book before the power went out. The lights always went out during the big storms. She'd already set candles and flashlights on the kitchen table, just like she always did. The wind picked up around 6 o'clock, rattling the windows and howling through the eaves. Margaret was just thinking about making herself some dinner when she heard it. A deep rumbling sound, like thunder, but different. She knew that sound. Motorcycles. She got up and went to the window, peering through the snow that was now falling thick and fast. Sure enough, there were headlights on the highway, moving slow. Real slow. The bikes were struggling, she could tell. The road was already getting bad. It was only going to get worse. Margaret watched as the group of motorcycles pulled off to the side of the road. Right near her property line. She counted them. 15 bikes? Maybe more. The riders were climbing off, and even from this distance, she could see they were in trouble. They were dressed in leather jackets and vests. Not nearly enough for a Montana blizzard. Her neighbor Betty had warned her just last week about bikers passing through town. Those Hell's Angels, Betty had said, clutching her purse like someone might snatch it right there in the grocery store. You stay away from them, Margaret. They're dangerous people. But looking at those men out there in the storm, all Margaret could see was people who needed help. The temperature was already below freezing, and it was dropping fast. Nobody could survive out there tonight, not dressed like that. She grabbed her heavy coat from the hook by the door and pulled on Harold's old boots. They were too big for her, but they were warm and waterproof. She took the big flashlight from the kitchen table and stepped out onto the porch. The wind hit her like a slap in the face. Snow was already piling up on the steps, and she had to hold on to the railing to keep from slipping. She clicked on the flashlight and waved it toward the road, back and forth, back and forth. At first nothing happened. Then she saw movement. The bikers had noticed her light. A couple of them started walking toward her property, moving slow through the deepening snow. Margaret made her way down the steps and across the yard. Meeting them halfway, the first man to reach her was big, with a gray beard crusted with ice. His face was red from the cold, and she could see him shivering even through all that leather. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough, "we don't mean to bother you. Our bikes can't handle this storm. We're just trying to figure out what to do. And what you're going to do is get inside before you freeze to death," Margaret said firmly. "All of you and those motorcycles can go in my barn." The man looked surprised. He turned back to his friends, then looked at Margaret again. "Ma'am, there's 15 of us. We can't just—" "You certainly can, and you will," Margaret interrupted. "I've got a big house and nobody to fill it. Now stop arguing with an old lady and get moving. This storm isn't going to wait." The biker called out to the others, and they came trudging through the snow. Up close, Margaret could see they were all cold. Really cold. Their hands were shaking, and some of them could barely talk through their chattering teeth. They looked tough with all that leather and those patches on their vests. But right now, they just looked like cold, scared men. Margaret led them to the barn first. It took some work to get all those heavy motorcycles inside, but they managed. The barn was old, but solid, and it would keep the bikes safe from the storm. Then she herded all 15 of them toward the house. Boots off at the door, she instructed as they crowded onto her porch. "I just cleaned these floors last week." She heard a couple of them chuckle at that, which made her smile. Inside, she pointed to the living room. "Sit anywhere you can find space. I'll get blankets and start making more food." The men filed in, looking around at her home like they weren't quite sure this was real. They moved carefully, almost nervously, trying not to knock anything over with their big frames and heavy jackets. Margaret noticed them looking at the photos on the walls, the knitted Afghans on the couch, the doilies on the end tables. This probably wasn't what they expected. She brought out every blanket and pillow she owned, piling them on the couch and chairs. Then she went to the kitchen and started pulling things from the cabinets. The soup she'd made earlier would help, but it wouldn't be enough for 15 hungry men. She found 2 loaves of bread, butter, a pot roast from yesterday, potatoes, carrots, and the ingredients for cornbread. While she worked, she could hear them talking in low voices in the living room. They were warming up, she could tell. The shivering was stopping. When she carried out the first pot of soup with a stack of bowls, they all jumped up to help her. Sit down, she said, waving them back. "I've been taking care of people my whole life. I taught school for 40 years. 15 more mouths to feed is nothing." The gray-bearded man who'd spoken to her first took a bowl and thanked her. "I'm Jake," he said. "And ma'am, I don't know how to thank you for this. You probably saved our lives tonight." Margaret ladled soup into another bowl. "Call me Margaret. And you don't need to thank me. This is just what people do. At least it's what they should do." As the night went on and the storm raged outside, Margaret's house filled with something it hadn't felt in 2 years. Life, warmth, the sound of people. She brought out more food, and the men ate like they hadn't seen a home-cooked meal in months. Maybe they hadn't, and slowly, as they ate and warmed up, they started to talk. Really talk. Not just about the storm or the road, but about their lives. About where they'd been and where they were going. About family and loss, and the kind of loneliness that makes you take to the highway, looking for something you can't quite name. Margaret listened to all of it, and in their stories she heard echoes of her own life. These rough-looking men with their tattoos and leather weren't so different after all. They were just people trying to find their way, same as everyone else. The wind howled against the house, but inside it was warm and getting warmer. Margaret watched as the 15 bikers settled into her living room. Some on the couch, others on the floor with their backs against the wall. They'd shed their heavy leather jackets, and underneath, they were just regular men in flannel shirts and worn jeans. Young ones, old ones, thin and heavy, all different kinds of people brought together by the road and now by the storm. Jake, the gray-bearded one, who seemed to be their leader, held his soup bowl carefully, like he was afraid he might break it. Margaret noticed his hands were scarred and rough, the hands of someone who'd worked hard all his life. He caught her looking and gave her a small, almost shy smile. "This is really good soup, Margaret," he said. "Best I've had in a long time." "It's nothing fancy," she replied, bringing out the cornbread she'd just pulled from the oven. "Just vegetables and some beef. My mother's recipe." Younger biker, couldn't have been more than 30, reached for a piece of cornbread like it was treasure. "My grandma used to make cornbread," he said quietly. "Haven't had it since she passed." Margaret felt her heart squeeze a little. She cut him an extra-large piece and put it on his plate. "Well, eat up then. There's plenty." As they ate, the conversation started flowing more icily. The initial awkwardness of the situation was melting away like snow and sunshine. These men had been hesitant at first, probably worried about imposing on an old woman. But Margaret's warmth was hard to resist. "How long have you lived here?" asked one of the bikers, a man with kind eyes and graying hair at his temples. 50 years in this house," Margaret said, settling into Harold's recliner. "My husband and I bought it when we got married. Raised our daughter here, though she's in Seattle now with her own family." 50 years, Jake repeated, shaking his head. "That's a long time in one place. We're not much good at staying put." Margaret smiled. Harold wasn't either, at least not when he was younger. He had a motorcycle too, back in the day. A Harley, though I can't remember the exact model. He loved that thing, It got their attention. Several of the men sat up straighter, suddenly more interested. "Your husband rode?" one of them asked. "Oh, yes," Margaret said, her eyes getting that faraway look they always did when she talked about Harold. "Before we were married, he'd ride all over the state. After the war, he said the road was the only place he felt free. Korea did something to him, like it did to a lot of men. The riding helped." The room got quiet for a moment. A couple of the bikers nodded slowly, understanding something unspoken. "Is that him?" Jake asked, pointing to a photo on the wall. It showed a young man standing next to a motorcycle, grinning at the camera. "That's him," Margaret said softly. "That was taken in 1953, right before we met. I was teaching second grade, and he came to fix the school's heating system. Thought he was trouble with that motorcycle and that smile. Turned out I was right, but it was the best kind of trouble." She got up and took the photo down, bringing it over so they could see it better. The men passed it around carefully, studying the young man in the picture. "He was one of us," Jake said finally. "It wasn't a question." "He was one of everyone," Margaret replied. "He could talk to anybody, fit in anywhere. But yes, he loved the motorcycle community. Used to go to rallies, helped organize veteran rides. He said bikers were the most loyal people he'd ever met." Outside, the storm was getting worse. The wind screamed and the snow piled higher against the windows. But inside Margaret's living room, something unexpected was happening. These strangers were becoming less strange with every passing minute. A biker named Russell, who'd been quiet up until now, spoke up. "My dad was in Vietnam. Never talked about it much, but he rode too. Said the same thing, that the road was the only place the noise in his head stopped." Others started sharing their own stories. One man talked about losing his job and his house in the same month, how the motorcycle club had been there when his own family wasn't. Another talked about getting sober, how his brothers on the bikes had helped him stay clean for 6 years now. A younger guy mentioned his son, how he was trying to be a better father than his own had been. Margaret listened to all of it. Really listened, the way she'd listened to her students for 40 years. She heard the pain and the hope mixed together in their words. These weren't the dangerous criminals Betty had warned her about. They were just men who'd found family in an unconventional place. "You were a teacher?" asked a biker with a long scar down his cheek. "For my whole career," Margaret said proudly. "Second grade, mostly. Had hundreds of students over the years. I still run into them sometimes at the grocery store, all grown up with kids of their own." "I bet you were good at it," the scarred man said. "You've got that way about you." "My second grade teacher, Mrs. Chen, she was the only one who was ever patient with me. I had a hard time sitting still, you know. But she never gave up," Margaret smiled. "Those are always my favorite students. The wiggly ones who can't sit still. They're usually the most creative, just need someone to see it." As the night wore on, Margaret started noticing things she hadn't seen at first. The house was colder than it should be, and she could hear dripping sounds from somewhere upstairs. She excused herself and went to check. Finding buckets placed strategically in the hallway to catch water leaking from the roof, she'd almost forgotten about those. The roof had been leaking since last spring. She couldn't afford to get it fixed. When she came back downstairs, Jake was standing in the kitchen, looking at the old furnace in the utility room. The door was open, and he was studying it with a thoughtful expression. "This thing sounds like it's on its last legs," he said. Margaret waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, it's been making that noise for months. Still works mostly. I just have to keep the fireplace going to help it along." Jake looked at her for a long moment, then around the kitchen. She saw his eyes pause on the window where the frame was rotting, on the corner where water stains marked the ceiling, on the back door that didn't quite close right anymore. "Margaret," he said gently, "when's the last time you had help with this place?" She felt her cheeks warm. "Oh, I manage fine. I'm stronger than I look." But they both knew that wasn't really an answer. The truth was, since Harold died, everything had been slowly falling apart. Her daughter sent money when she could, but she had her own family to think about. The pension wasn't quite enough to cover both living expenses and repairs, so Margaret had learned to live with leaks and drafts and a furnace that barely worked. Jake didn't push, just nodded and went back to the living room. But Margaret saw him whispering to some of the other men, saw them glancing around the room with new eyes. She felt a mixture of embarrassment and something else. Something that felt almost like hope, though she couldn't say why. By midnight, the storm was at its worst. The power flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Margaret lit the candles and brought out more blankets. The bikers arranged themselves around the living room and dining room, making beds on the floor. Some of them were already snoring softly. Jake was the last one still awake besides Margaret. They sat by the firelight, not saying much, just listening to the storm rage outside. "Thank you," he said finally, "for not seeing what everyone else sees when they look at us." Margaret thought about that for a moment. "I see what Harold would have seen," she said. "People who need help. People who'd help others if they got the chance. That's all anyone really is, isn't it?" Jake smiled, and in the firelight he looked younger somehow. "You remind me of my mother," he said. "She passed 10 years ago. Cancer. She would have done exactly what you did tonight." "Then she raised you right," Margaret said simply, as she finally headed upstairs to her own bed, leaving the bikers to sleep in the warmth of her home. Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, like the house was alive again, like she wasn't quite so alone. She didn't know these men, not really, but somehow that didn't seem to matter. Outside, the blizzard continued to bury Montana under feet of snow. But inside one small farmhouse, 15 strangers and one kind old lady had found something unexpected. A reminder that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up when you need them. And sometimes it's about who you show up for. Morning came slowly, with pale gray light filtering through the snow-covered windows. Margaret woke to the smell of coffee, which confused her for a moment. She always made her own coffee. Then she remembered the 15 men sleeping in her living room and smiled. She put on her robe and slippers and made her way downstairs. The house was warm, warmer than it had been in months. Someone had kept the fire going all night. In the kitchen, she found Russell standing by the coffee pot, looking a bit sheepish. "Hope you don't mind," he said. "Found the coffee in the cabinet. Thought you might want some when you woke up. Mind?" "Honey, you just became my favorite person," Margaret said, accepting the mug he handed her. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly how she liked it. The other men were starting to wake up, stretching and folding blankets. They were quiet, respectful, trying not to make too much noise. Margaret went to the window and pulled back the curtain. What she saw made her gasp snow. Everywhere, the world had turned completely white overnight. The drifts were easily 3 feet high, maybe more in some places. The road wasn't even visible anymore, just a smooth white expanse that could have been anything. The barn was almost buried, just the roof peeking out. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. Jake came to stand beside her, coffee mug in his own scarred hands. "That's something," he said quietly. "Haven't seen a storm like that in years." "The plow will come through eventually," Margaret said, though she knew it might be a day or two. The county always did the main roads first. Her little stretch of highway was pretty far down the list. The men gathered around the window, looking out at the transformed landscape. Some of them whistled low, others just shook their heads. Their motorcycles were safe in the barn, but they weren't going anywhere today. Maybe not tomorrow either. "Guess we're stuck here a bit longer," Jake said, looking at Margaret. "If that's all right with you?" "Of course it is," Margaret said firmly. "Nobody's going out in that. Now who's hungry?" She'd said the magic words. Within minutes, her kitchen was full of hungry men offering to help. Margaret put them to work, directing them like she used to direct her second graders during craft time. Someone cracked eggs, someone else found the bacon in the fridge, another started making toast. It was chaotic and crowded, and Margaret loved every second of it. While they cooked breakfast together, Jake had wandered off. Margaret noticed him going upstairs, heard his footsteps in the hallway above. She thought about saying something, but decided against it. He seemed like a respectful man. He wouldn't pry. But when he came back down, his face was serious. He caught the eye of a few other men and jerked his head toward the stairs. They followed him up, and Margaret heard them walking around, opening doors. Their voices low and concerned. They came back down as everyone was sitting down to eat. Jake pulled out a chair next to Margaret and sat down heavily. Margaret, he said carefully, I hope you don't think I was being nosy, but I saw the buckets upstairs, and the water damage on the ceiling, and that back bedroom where the window doesn't close all the way. Margaret felt her face get hot. Oh, that. It's nothing, really. Just some old house problems. Every house has them. That roof is leaking in at least 4 places, said another biker. A man named Dennis, who apparently knew something about construction. The furnace down here is barely hanging on. Your porch has boards that are rotted clean through. Margaret, this house needs serious work. She looked down at her plate, suddenly not hungry anymore. I know, she said quietly. I know it does. But Harold always handled those things, and now he's gone, and I just don't have the money for it. My pension covers the basics, and my daughter helps when she can. But repairs like that, they cost thousands of dollars. So I make do. The room got very quiet. Margaret could feel all of them looking at her, and she wished they'd just drop it. She was used to making do. It was fine. She was fine. How long has it been like this? Jake asked gently. The roof started leaking last spring. The furnace has been acting up for about a year. The porch, well, that's been getting worse for a while now. She forced a smile. But I manage. I'm tougher than I look. Jake exchanged glances with the other men. Something passed between them, some unspoken communication that Margaret couldn't quite read. Then Jake nodded slowly and took a bite of his eggs. These are good, he said, changing the subject. Really good? Conversation moved on to other things, but Margaret noticed the men kept looking around the house with new eyes. They saw every crack in the plaster, every stain on the ceiling, every draft that snuck through the old windows. She wanted to tell them to stop, that it wasn't their problem. But she kept quiet and ate her breakfast. After the meal, the men insisted on cleaning up. Margaret sat in Harold's recliner and watched them work. These tough bikers washing dishes and wiping down counters like they did it every day. It was strange and sweet and made her throat feel tight. Jake disappeared again, this time taking his cell phone with him. He stood by the front window where the signal was strongest, making call after call. Margaret could hear bits and pieces of his conversations, but couldn't make out the details. He looked intense, focused, like he was planning something important. The day passed slowly. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind still blew, creating swirls and drifts that changed the landscape by the hour. The men found ways to keep busy. Some played cards with a deck Margaret found in a drawer. Others looked through Harold's old motorcycle magazines, which Margaret had kept in a box in the closet. A few of them went out to the barn to check on the bikes and came back reporting that everything was secure. Margaret taught 2 of the younger ones how to play chess using Harold's old set. She told them stories about her students over the years. The funny things kids say, the proud moments when a struggling student finally understands something. The men listened like it was the most interesting thing they'd ever heard. As afternoon turned to evening, Jake gathered all the men together. They huddled in the corner of the living room, speaking in low voices. Margaret pretended not to notice, but she could feel something building. Some decision being made. Finally, as the sun was setting and painting the snow orange and pink, Jake came over to her chair and knelt down, so he was at her eye level. Margaret, he said, you saved our lives yesterday. You didn't have to. Most people would have locked their doors and left us out there in that storm. But you didn't see danger when you looked at us. You saw people who needed help. Well, of course, Margaret said, confused about where this was going. Anyone would have done the same. No, Jake said firmly. They wouldn't have. Most people cross the street when they see us coming. They hold their purses tighter. They tell their kids to stay away. You gave us food and warmth and kindness, and you asked for nothing in return. Margaret didn't know what to say to that, so she just waited. You're leaving tomorrow, Jake continued. The plow came through about an hour ago. Roads clear enough for us to ride safely. Margaret felt a pang of disappointment which surprised her. She'd known they couldn't stay forever, but these 2 days had been nice. The house had felt alive again. But before we go, Jake said, and his scarred face broke into a smile, we want to do something for you. Something to say thank you properly. Would that be okay? Oh, you don't need to do anything, Margaret protested. Really? It was nothing. It wasn't nothing, Jake said. It was everything. So here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow morning, you're going to see something that might surprise you. Don't be alarmed. We're going to fix some things around here. All of us. We've got friends coming to help. Friends? Margaret said. How many friends? Jake's smile got bigger. Enough. Trust me, Margaret. We take care of our own, and after what you did for us, you're one of ours now. That night, Margaret lay in bed listening to the men settling down for one last night in her home. She heard their quiet conversations, their laughter, the sound of someone snoring. She thought about what Jake had said. You're one of ours now? She'd been alone for so long. Her daughter was far away. Her friends were getting older. Some had moved away. Some had passed on. This house that once rang with life had become so quiet she sometimes went days without speaking to anyone. But these 2 days had changed something. These men, who the world called dangerous, had shown her more kindness than she'd known in years. They'd shared their stories, their pain, their hopes. They'd made her laugh. They'd made her feel useful again. Whatever they had planned for tomorrow, Margaret decided she'd let them do it. Not because her house needed fixing, though it did, but because they needed to give her something, the way she'd needed to give them shelter. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is letting them help you. As she drifted off to sleep, Margaret heard the distant rumble of more motorcycles on the highway. She smiled in the darkness, though she didn't quite know why. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. Margaret woke to a sound that made her heart jump. It was distant at first, like thunder rolling across the mountains, but it kept getting louder and louder. She sat up in bed, confused and a little frightened. What on earth was that noise? She threw on her robe and hurried to the window. What she saw made her freeze in place, her hand pressed against her chest. Motorcycles. Dozens of them. Maybe more than dozens. They were coming down the highway in a long line, their engines rumbling like a pride of lions. The morning sun glinted off chrome and metal, and she could see leather vests and jackets on every rider. They were turning onto her property, one after another, lining up along her fence line and in her yard. "Oh, my Lord," Margaret whispered. She rushed downstairs, nearly tripping over her slippers in her hurry. The 15 men who'd spent the night were already awake, grinning like kids on Christmas morning. Jake stood by the front door, watching through the window with his arms crossed and a satisfied smile on his face. "Hey, what is this?" Margaret asked, her voice shaking a little. "What's happening?" "This," Jake said, turning to face her, "is your thank you. Come on, let me introduce you." He opened the front door, and the cold morning air rushed in, along with the rumble of engines. Margaret stepped out onto her porch, pulling her robe tighter, and stopped dead. There had to be 100 motorcycles in her yard. Maybe more. Everywhere she looked, there were bikers climbing off their rides, stretching, talking to each other, unloading things from saddlebags and trailers. A massive trailer had been pulled up near the barn, and men were already opening it up. Inside, she could see tools, lumber, shingles, and supplies of all kinds. Another truck pulled in behind it, this one filled with more materials. And another, Margaret Jake said, his voice carrying across the yard. "These are my brothers and sisters from chapters all across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. When I told them what you did for us, when I told them about your house, they all wanted to come help." A woman with long gray hair braided down her back came forward. She was probably about Margaret's age, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "I'm Linda," she said. "Jake called me yesterday. Said we had a lady who needed some help. So we came." "But I don't understand," Margaret said, feeling tears start to prick at her eyes. "This is too much. I can't pay for all this." "Nobody's asking you to pay," said a tall man with a beard down to his chest. "We take care of our own. Jake says you're family now. That means we take care of you." Before Margaret could protest further, the yard erupted into organized chaos. It was like watching a military operation. Groups of bikers split off into teams, each with a specific job. Some headed for the roof with ladders and tools. Others went to inspect the furnace. A team headed to the porch with hammers and new boards. More went around the outside of the house, examining windows and siding. Jake gently guided Margaret back inside. "You might want to get dressed," he said kindly. "This is going to be a long day, and you're going to have a lot of company." Margaret went upstairs in a daze. From her bedroom window, she could see the property crawling with bikers, all of them working. Someone had already climbed onto her roof and was pulling up old shingles. The sound of hammers and power tools filled the air. She sat on her bed for a moment, trying to process what was happening. These people, these strangers, had driven hundreds of miles to help her. They'd brought supplies and tools in their own time, asking nothing in return. She thought about what Jake had said. "We take care of our own." When had she become one of their own? Was it really just because she'd let them shelter from a storm? No, she realized. It was because she'd seen them as people first. Not as scary bikers or troublemakers or any of the things the world tried to label them. Just as people who needed help. And now they were returning that kindness 100-fold. When she came back downstairs dressed, Linda was in her kitchen making coffee in the biggest pot Margaret had ever seen. 3 other women were with her, unpacking groceries Margaret definitely hadn't bought. "We brought food," Linda explained. "Can't have all these people working without feeding them. Hope you don't mind us taking over your kitchen?" "I don't mind at all," Margaret said, still feeling like she was in a dream. The day unfolded like something out of a movie. The team on the roof worked with precision and speed, stripping away old damaged shingles and replacing them with new ones. Margaret watched in amazement as the holes that had leaked for a year disappeared under fresh materials. They worked in shifts, never getting in each other's way. Like they'd done this 1,000 times before. In the basement, a group of men had the old furnace completely apart. "This thing's done for," one of them called up. "But don't worry, we brought a new one." "You brought a furnace?" Margaret said, astonished. "2 of them, actually," Jake said with a grin. "Wasn't sure what size you'd need. We'll install the right one and donate the other to someone else who needs it." The porch was completely torn up by noon, all the rotted boards removed. Margaret watched as they laid down new support beams and started putting down fresh lumber. The wood was beautiful, strong, and solid. One of the bikers was even carving a design into the railing, something with flowers and vines that reminded her of the garden Harold used to keep. People kept arriving throughout the morning. A news van pulled up around 10, and a reporter got out with a camera crew. Margaret was standing in the yard, watching the work, when the reporter approached her. "Ma'am, I'm Jennifer from Channel 7 News. We heard about what's happening here. Can we ask you a few questions?" Margaret looked at Jake, who shrugged and smiled. "It's up to you," he said. So Margaret found herself on camera, trying to explain how this had all started with a snowstorm and 15 cold men who needed shelter. The reporter looked amazed, then asked to interview some of the bikers. Jake and a few others agreed, and Margaret listened as they explained their philosophy. "People see the leather and the motorcycles, and they make assumptions," Jake told the camera. "But we're just people. We look after each other. And when someone like Margaret shows us real kindness, we don't forget it. This isn't about paying her back. This is about honoring the kind of person she is." Another biker, a younger guy with tattoos covering his arms, added his own thoughts. "My mom raised me to help people who help you." Margaret didn't see scary bikers. She saw human beings in trouble. That's rare. That's special. "So yeah, we drove all night to be here, because that's what you do for family." By lunchtime, the transformation was already visible. The roof was halfway done, and not a single leak remained. The new furnace was being installed, and the house was warmer than it had been in a year. The porch was taking shape, sturdy and beautiful. Windows had been repaired and resealed. Even the old barn was getting attention. With a team fixing loose boards and rehinging the big door Linda and the other women had set up. A buffet line in Margaret's dining room and kitchen, with food covering every available surface. There were sandwiches and hot dogs, chips and salads, cookies and brownies. The bikers came through in waves, eating quickly and getting back to work. Margaret tried to help serve food, but Linda shooed her away. "You're the guest of honor," Linda said firmly. "You sit down and let us handle this." So Margaret sat at her own kitchen table and watched her house fill with laughter and conversation. Tough-looking men with weathered faces joked with each other while balancing paper plates. Women with leather vests and silver jewelry organized supplies with military efficiency. Young bikers worked alongside older ones, everyone contributing whatever skills they had. A little boy, maybe 7 or 8, came running through. He belonged to one of the bikers, and he was having the time of his life watching all the motorcycles in activity. He stopped by Margaret's chair, eyes wide. "Are you the nice lady my dad told me about?" he asked. "I don't know," Margaret said with a smile. "Who's your dad?" "That's him," the boy pointed to Russell, the man who'd made coffee that first morning. "He said you saved his life in a snowstorm. He said you're a hero." Margaret felt her eyes water. "Oh, honey, I'm not a hero. I just did what anyone should do. That's what makes you a hero," the little boy said seriously. Then ran off to watch the work on the porch. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret walked around her property in wonder. The roof was completely finished, covered in new shingles that would last for decades. The furnace was installed and running smoothly, heating the house better than it had in years. The porch was done, complete with the carved railing and a fresh coat of paint. Someone had even fixed the gutters and cleared out years of leaves and debris, but they weren't stopping. A team was working on the outside of the house now, fixing siding and painting over water stains. Another group was splitting and stacking firewood, creating a pile that would last her through to winters. Someone else was fixing her fence, placing rotted posts and tightening sagging wire. Jake found her standing by the barn, watching it all with tears running down her face. "Too much?" he asked gently. "No," Margaret said, wiping her eyes. "Not too much. Just right." "I don't know how to thank you all." "You already did," Jake said. "2 nights ago, when you waved that flashlight and brought us inside, Margaret, you reminded us why we do what we do. We're not just a motorcycle club. We're a family, and family helps family." The next morning, Margaret woke up in a house that felt different. Not just because it was warmer or because the roof didn't leak anymore. It felt different because it felt full again, even though it was just her. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was peaceful. She made her coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking around at the space that had been transformed. Everything was clean and fixed and solid. Through the window, she could see her beautiful new porch and the neat stack of firewood that would keep her warm for years. It was almost too much to believe. Her phone rang, making her jump. It was her daughter calling from Seattle. "Mom, you're on the news." Her daughter practically shouted, "It's everywhere." Someone sent me a link to the story. "Mom, there's video of you and all those bikers." "What happened?" Margaret laughed and spent the next 20 minutes telling the whole story. Her daughter cried, then laughed, then cried some more. "I should have been there to help you with the house," she said, her voice thick with guilt. "I didn't know it was that bad, honey. You have your own family to take care of," Margaret said gently. "And besides, I think this was meant to happen exactly the way it did. I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." After they hung up, Margaret turned on her television. Sure enough, there she was on the morning news. The story had been picked up by stations all over the state, then the region, and now it was going national. She watched herself on screen, looking small and old in her robe, talking about the storm and the 15 men who needed shelter. Then the footage showed the 100 bikers arriving, the house being repaired, the interviews with Jake and the others. The news anchor called it a heartwarming reminder that kindness comes back to you and proof that we shouldn't judge people by their appearance. Margaret's phone didn't stop ringing all day. Friends from church called. Former students called. People she hadn't heard from in years were reaching out to say they'd seen the story. Her neighbor Betty even called, apologizing for warning Margaret away from bikers and saying how wrong she'd been. But the most surprising call came 3 days later. It was Jake. "Margaret, I hope I'm not bothering you," he said. "But the club had a meeting last night, and we voted on something. We'd like to make you an honorary member of our extended family. Official-like." Margaret didn't know what to say. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means we check on you regular," Jake explained. "We've set up a schedule. Different members will stop by once a month, make sure everything's working right, help with anything heavy you need done. Linda's already planning to take you to lunch next week, and we'd like to invite you to some of our events if you're interested. We do a lot of charity work, toy drives for kids, fundraisers for veterans. We could use someone with your heart involved. You want me at biker events? Margaret said, laughing. I'm 78 years old. Linda's 76, Jake countered. Age doesn't matter. Heart does. What do you say? What could she say? Yes, I'd be honored. True to their word, the bikers became a constant presence in Margaret's life, but not in an overwhelming way. Russell stopped by 2 weeks later to check on the furnace and ended up staying for lunch. His son, the little boy who'd called her a hero, came with him and told Margaret all about school while eating 3 of her homemade cookies. Linda came. The following weekend took Margaret to lunch in town. People stared as the 2 women walked into the diner together. One in a leather vest with patches, the other in her Sunday cardigan. Margaret held her head high and enjoyed every minute of it. A month after the repairs, Jake called to invite her to a toy drive the club was organizing for Christmas. Margaret not only attended, she brought 3 of her friends from church who wanted to help. The bikers and the church ladies worked side by side, sorting toys and wrapping presents for kids who wouldn't otherwise have much under the tree. The story never quite died down. Magazines called wanting to do features. A podcast interviewed Jake about the club's philosophy of giving back. Someone even started a social media page sharing stories of bikers helping people, using Margaret's story as the inspiration. But for Margaret, the best part wasn't the attention or even the repaired house. It was the family she'd gained. Every few weeks, different members would stop by. Sometimes they needed something themselves, advice, or just someone to talk to. And Margaret was always happy to listen. Other times they brought things. A pie Linda had baked firewood, someone had extra of, or just their company for an afternoon. The local chapter started holding their monthly charity, planning meetings at Margaret's house. Her dining room table, which had sat empty for 2 years, was suddenly covered with papers and coffee cups and passionate discussions about how to help the community. Margaret made cookies and offered suggestions, drawing on her 40 years of teaching experience to help organize their youth outreach programs. She went to her first rally that spring. Jake and Linda picked her up on a sunny Saturday morning, and Margaret climbed into the sidecar of Jake's motorcycle. She'd never ridden in a sidecar before, and the feeling of wind in her hair and sun on her face brought back memories of riding with Harold. All those years ago, the rally was bigger than she'd expected. Hundreds of motorcycles and thousands of people. But everywhere she went, bikers greeted her with respect and warmth. Word had spread about the lady who saved the guys in the storm, and people wanted to meet her, shake her hand, thank her for reminding everyone what their community was supposed to be about. A young woman with purple hair and tattoos covering her arms hugged Margaret and whispered, "My grandma just passed. You remind me of her. Thank you for being here." An older biker with a white beard and a cane told her, "I heard what you did. That's what this is supposed to be about. Looking out for each other. You get it?" Margaret realized something that day. She'd spent 2 years thinking her life was winding down, that her useful days were behind her. But she'd been wrong. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. She had purpose again. She had family again. She had life again. Her daughter came to visit that summer and couldn't believe the transformation. It's not just in the house, but in Margaret herself. "Mom, you're glowing," she said. "I haven't seen you this happy since Dad was alive." "I found my people," Margaret said simply. "Or maybe they found me. Either way, I'm not alone anymore." The following winter, when the first snow started falling, Margaret stood at her window and remembered that night a year ago. 15 cold men on motorcycles, a storm that could have killed them, and a simple decision to help. She'd had no idea that opening her door would open her whole life back up. Jake called that evening, just checking in like he did whenever bad weather rolled through. "You doing okay, Margaret? Need anything?" "I'm perfect," she said, and she meant it. "The new furnace is working great. The roof isn't leaking, and I'm not scared of the storm." "Good," Jake said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "But if you need anything at all, you call." You're family now. That doesn't change. After they hung up, Margaret made herself a cup of tea and settled into Harold's old recliner. She thought about how strange life was. How you could think you knew how your story would end and then everything could change because of one night. One decision, one act of simple kindness. People had asked her, in all those interviews, why she'd helped the bikers when everyone said they were dangerous. Margaret always gave the same answer. I looked out my window and I didn't see Hell's Angels. I didn't see scary bikers. I just saw people who needed help. And if I couldn't help people when they needed it, what was the point of anything? But the truth was deeper than that. Yes, she'd helped them. But they'd saved her right back. They'd saved her from loneliness and purposelessness, and the slow fade into invisibility that so many elderly people face. They'd reminded her that she mattered, that she was needed. Her life still had chapters left to write. The house was quiet that night, but it was a good quiet. A warm quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when you know you're not really alone. When you know that family is just a phone call away. When you know that your door might get knocked on at any time by someone who wants to check on you, or share a meal, or just sit and talk. Margaret thought about Harold and wished he could see this. But maybe he could. Maybe he'd planned it somehow, sending those 15 bikers to her door on that snowy night. Knowing what would happen next, she finished her tea and headed up to bed. Walking through a house that no longer leaked or creaked or felt empty, outside, she could hear the wind picking up, another storm rolling in. But she wasn't worried. Her roof was solid. Her furnace worked perfectly. And if anything did go wrong, she had 100 brothers and sisters who would ride through hell itself to help her. That's what family does. And Margaret, after being alone for so long, had more family than she'd ever dreamed possible. All because she'd decided to wave a flashlight on a dark, snowy night and invite strangers into her home. Sometimes, she thought, as she drifted off to sleep, the best things in life start with the simplest acts of kindness. You never know when helping someone might change everything. For them and for you.